The year is 2000. Picture a newsstand.
Okay.
You walk up to it, and there is the cover of the Economist magazine.
Oh, I know exactly the one you mean.
Right. It has this stark photograph of a man holding a rocket-propelled grenade. And the headline is just, it's brutal. It says, "The Hopeless Continent."
Yeah, that was literally a death sentence in the eyes of the global financial world.
Completely. They basically looked at sub-Saharan Africa and told investors, do not bother. It is over.
Wrap it up. Nothing to see here.
But then, and this is why we are here today, almost the second that ink dried, the impossible happened.
It really did.
The continent exploded like a massive growth miracle. We're talking about countries suddenly hitting over 6% annual growth.
Yeah, which left Western scholars completely stunned. Pundits were just speechless.
Because it completely broke their models. So, welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to uncover the astonishing, completely silent truth behind this renaissance.
And it is a story that totally ignores the usual talking points.
Exactly. You've probably heard the traditional narratives. People point to geopolitics.
Yeah.
Or they talk about the global commodity supercycle.
Right. Or the idea that the so-called resource curse was finally broken.
Foreign aid. Endless debates about international infrastructure projects. Forget all of that.
Yeah, we can set those top-down explanations aside today because they miss the actual engine.
We are unpacking a monumental 2017 working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER.
Right, by Xin Diao, Kenneth Hartgen, and Margaret Macmillan.
And what they did is they bypassed the politicians entirely. Today, we are looking at the raw, micro-level truth.
Down in the dirt.
Literally. We are going to show you how millions of individual people making the quiet decision to change their daily jobs entirely rewrote the destiny of a continent.
It wasn't boardrooms, it was agricultural fields, rural schools, and, semi-urban street markets.
So to understand this miracle, we first have to tackle this massive prejudice in the Western academic world.
Oh, the data bias.
Yes. The deeply entrenched belief that African economic data is just, garbage.
It was a very real prejudice. For the longest time, if an African nation reported a huge surge in GDP, the immediate reflex from Western economists was just to dismiss it.
Like, oh, that's just a statistical mirage.
Exactly. Your data is flawed, therefore your growth is an illusion. They'd argue that the national statistical agencies were underfunded, or that the informal economy, the street vendors, the unregistered mechanics, was just too vast to measure.
It is essentially the gaslighting of an entire continent.
He really is.
But Diao, Hartgen, and Macmillan did something absolutely brilliant to bypass this. They asked a really simple question. What happens when two completely independent, wildly different mountains of data accidentally prove each other right?
Yeah, they created a historical handshake.
Let's break that down. Look at the first set of data, the macro view.
So they started with the Africa Sector Database from the Groningen Growth and Development Center, the GGDC.
Which is like the gold standard, right?
Yeah, highly respected. They use official national accounts and census data to map out the big picture of employment and productivity across 11 countries.
But, and this is key, the researchers knew the skeptics in the West would still just reject that government-level census data.
Right, because of that entrenched bias.
So they took that macro data and they smashed it against something entirely different. The demographic and health surveys, the DHS.
And this methodology is just fascinating.
Explain how the DHS works because it's so different.
Well, the DHS operates on a completely different paradigm. It doesn't rely on some centralized government bureau predicting trends. These are funded by international organizations, and they rely on human beings physically walking into villages.
Door to door.
Literally door to door across 24 different countries. They knock on doors and do these incredibly granular interviews with over 1 million families.
1 million families. That is massive.
Massive. And they ask about household assets, health, and crucially, the specific daily occupations of every single adult in the home.
So if you're listening to this right now, think about the contrast here. On one side, you have economists in a capital city looking at official export ledgers.
Right.
And on the other side, you have a surveyor sitting in a rural living room asking a family, hey, how many hours did you spend trading goods at the market versus working in the field this week?
Exactly. And because the DHS asks these hyper-specific questions, it captures the invisible economy.
The people the government usually misses.
Yes, the informal sector. You have two totally different methodologies measuring reality from opposite ends of the spectrum.
And the result? They both showed the exact same trajectory.
An undeniable alignment.
They both revealed this massive drop, about 10 percentage points in the share of the population working in agriculture.
To see that kind of alignment is the holy grail for an economist. It totally removes the doubt. That 10% drop, that translates to tens of millions of people dropping the hoe and leaving the farm.
But here is a slap-in-the-face detail that completely challenges the prevailing wisdom. If you read the global media, there's this constant panic that Africa is suffering from premature deindustrialization.
Oh, yeah. The idea that their manufacturing sector is shrinking before it ever really grew.
But the data violently disagrees with that.
Violently. When you isolate the low-income African countries in the sample places like Ethiopia or Senegal, manufacturing didn't shrink.
It expanded.
Yes. Between 2000 and 2010, it expanded by 1.46 percentage points.
Okay, wait. I have to push back on that.
Sure.
1.46%. That sounds like a statistical rounding error. If we are talking about an economic miracle,
Yeah.
shouldn't we be seeing like double-digit industrial explosions? Are we seriously celebrating less than a 2% growth in manufacturing jobs?
I get why that sounds small,
Yeah.
but context is literally everything here. We are not talking about total manufacturing output. We are talking about the share of the entire national workforce. In these ultra-low-income economies, the baseline for industrial jobs was microscopic. So shifting an additional 1.5% of the entire nation's labor force into manufacturing over a single decade, that is a huge structural pivot.
Oh, I see. It means the engine is actually turning on, not shutting down. It is stubbornly fighting back.
Exactly. Growing from a tiny base, but growing.
You know, people treat the continent like it is this economic freak of nature, like it's just cursed and defies normal human development. But if we adjust for how incredibly poor the starting line was,
Yeah.
aren't they just walking the exact same path the rest of human civilization walked?
That is one of the most profound conclusions of this paper. There are established mathematical laws of structural change. As any country grows, its people move from agriculture to services and industry.
Right.
But historically, scholars excluded Africa from these models. They just assumed the continent was broken.
Because of the hopeless continent syndrome.
Precisely. But when Diao and her team plugged the African data back in, controlling for the extreme low income, the anomaly vanished completely. The employment structure perfectly matches the historical laws of global development over the last 60 years.
So a nation like Senegal is behaving exactly the way an Asian or Latin American economy behaved when it was at that exact same level of poverty.
Her regression lines are practically identical. They never strayed from the main trunk of human civilization.
Okay, so if the mechanism is intact and they are following the normal path, we have to ask the obvious question. Why were they stuck in extreme poverty for so long? What froze the mechanism?
The answer is in the dirt.
It's the oldest profession in the world, farming.
Yes. Subsistence agriculture.
Right.
It was acting as an inescapable efficiency black hole.
Let's look at the numbers. In the year 2000, nearly 60% of the entire labor force across these nations was crammed into farming.
Over half the human potential of a continent tied to the soil.
And the researchers revealed this shocking statistic, that 60% of the workforce, their agricultural productivity was only 35% of the national average.
Just think about the math on that.
It is an astronomical waste of human energy. The vast majority of the population is producing this tiny, tiny fraction of the wealth.
It's a deep valley of inefficiency. But paradoxically, that sinkhole represents incredible potential energy.
How so?
Because the efficiency gaps between farming and every other sector are so huge, you have the opportunity for explosive national growth without needing to invent a single piece of new technology.
This is the mind-blowing part.
Yeah.
You don't need high-tech robots. You don't need million-dollar machinery. To multiply a nation's wealth, you literally just need a farmer to drop their hoe and move to the city.
The multiples are staggering. Manufacturing efficiency in these economies is 1.7 times higher than agriculture.
Wow.
Transport services, like driving a bus, is nearly 3 times higher. So a human being's economic value multiplies the instant they change their job title.
They call this the people-moving formula, or structural change. Let me try an analogy to see if I have the mechanics of this right.
Go for it.
Imagine a restaurant. You have 100 people crammed into the kitchen, right? And they're all peeling potatoes with wooden spoons.
Sounds crowded.
Super crowded. And the dining room out front is completely empty. No one is serving food.
Okay.
The traditional way we think about economic growth is within sector growth. That approach says, hey, We need to invent a laser-guided potato peeler to make these 100 people in the back faster.
Which takes years of research, huge capital engineering.
Exactly.
It's
Hard.
that-
But the structural change approach says, wait, why don't 50 of you just stop peeling potatoes, walk out to the front, and start serving food to the customers?
Right.
You don't need a new invention. You just move people to where the value is higher. And the restaurant's profits instantly explode.
That is a brilliant way to visualize their decomposition formula. National productivity growth has two distinct forces. The laser-guided potato peeler is your within-sector growth, capital accumulation, tech innovation.
And the hard stuff.
The very hard, slow stuff for a developing nation. And the people walking to the dining room is structural reallocation.
The easy stuff.
Yes. The paper proves that even if a country's technology completely stagnates, zero innovation national output can soar simply by labor flowing across those sectors. It is the cheapest wealth propeller.
If you are listening to this right now, just think about how wild that is. It is essentially free growth. Just alter human geography and the whole country gets richer.
It really is.
But wait, if moving people around is just basic economic gravity,
Yeah.
why didn't this happen in the 80s or 90s? Did someone just turn off gravity?
Well, no. But the destination matters just as much as the departure. And this leads us to a really dark chapter. Time travel back to the 1990s. The exact same people-moving formula actually suffocated the continent.
Wait, how does moving kill the economy? If leaving the farm makes you richer, how does the math reverse itself?
Because in the 90s, sub-Saharan Africa was battered by severe economic crises, massive external debt, and these really rigid structural adjustment programs mandated by international banks.
Right, they forced all these budget cuts.
Exactly. They forced rapid privatization. The immediate result was the collapse of the formal urban economy. Factories shut down, civil service jobs evaporated.
Like people were moving, but they were moving backward.
It was a tragedy of reverse migration. Workers who had productive jobs in the city lost their livelihoods. Some went into street survival, but many had to return to subsistence farming just to not starve.
So going back to the restaurant analogy, the 90s wasn't 50 people walking out to serve food.
Yeah.
It was firing all the waiters and forcing them into the alley to scavenge.
And the data reflects that tragedy perfectly. Between 1990 and 99, the structural change term was overwhelmingly negative. Economy-wide productivity growth was practically zero.
So it proves that urbanization only works if the destination is actually better than where you came from. But then the calendar flips. We enter the golden decade, 2000 to 2010. The mud pit is left behind. Debt relief kicks in.
And the turnaround is breathtaking. For the low-income African countries, economy-wide labor productivity suddenly surged to 2.81% annual growth.
And here is the stat that completely anchors this entire deep dive. Out of that 2.8, 1%. 1.5, 7 percentage points, came purely from people changing jobs.
Over 55% of the entire economic miracle of that decade was driven by structural change.
Not new tech, not foreign aid dropping bridges from the sky, just human beings leaving the farm for industry and services.
It's incredible.
But here's where it gets dangerous. Because we look at this African miracle, and our brains naturally map it onto the Asian miracle. We see China, India, Vietnam pulling millions out of poverty.
Yeah.
We assume it's the exact same engine.
That is a massive mistake, and the NBER paper is very explicit about this divergence.
Break that down. How are they different?
They compared developing Asia and low-income Africa during that exact same decade. Asia's total growth was massive, over 5%. But the internal composition was the mirror opposite of Africa's.
Really?
Yeah. In Asia, people moving from rural to urban areas was a factor. But the vast majority of their growth came from within-sector productivity.
The laser peeler.
Exactly. Once Asian workers got to the factory itself kept upgrading. Better tech, optimized assembly lines, moving from cheap textiles to electronics.
So Asia grew by making the machines bigger and faster. Africa grew almost entirely by just letting people move to the city.
Yes. And that distinction reveals a terrifying vulnerability.
Wait, I see where this is going. Moving people's easy, low-hanging fruit. But what happens when you run out of farmers to move?
That is the ticking clock beneath the African miracle. Structural reallocation is a finite resource. You can only move a worker from the field to the city once.
Right, once they're in the city, they can't move to the city again.
Precisely. When the massive productivity gap between the farm and the city eventually closes, the free ride ends. If these nations haven't figured out how to generate internal tech growth by the time that happens, the engine stalls.
The stakes are so high, it bought them time, but it's not permanent.
No, it's a window of opportunity.
Okay, let's zoom in on the actual human beings driving this shift. We've talked about tens of millions of people abandoning the fields. Who exactly are they?
This is one of my favorite parts of the paper.
Because if you picture like a 20-something young man packing his bags for a factory, you are dead wrong.
Completely wrong. The microdata from the DHS surveys completely shatters that assumption. They tracked exactly who dropped the hoe.
The subversive heroes of the African miracle, who are they?
Rural, middle-aged women, specifically women over the age of 25.
That is staggering. It runs contrary to almost every stereotype we have about global development. How did middle-aged rural women become the vanguard of this massive economic engine?
The data is totally unequivocal. Across the board, the drop in agricultural employment vastly outpaced men's when you look at rural females over 25. They are the primary demographic driving this shift.
But what was the catalyst? Was it government quotas? Microfinance?
It was education. But we aren't talking about university degrees here. The critical threshold was simply a basic primary school education.
Literally just the ability to read and write.
Yes. For rural women with just a primary education, their participation in agriculture plummeted by a staggering 12.11%.
Wow.
Compared to women with zero formal education, the drop was massively sharper.
We have to explain the mechanics of that, because how does basic literacy transform a 30-year-old woman into a one-person macroeconomic engine?
It provides the survival toolkit for the non-agrarian economy. Think about it. If a woman can read, she can understand a regional bus schedule to transport goods. If she can do basic arithmetic, she can transition from a village barter system into the cash economy. She can run a small trading stall, keep a basic ledger, and avoid getting scammed by middlemen.
So it lowers the barrier to entry just enough to make the leap to the city viable.
Exactly.
Think about the policy implications of that. The West spends billions debating industrial subsidies. But this data says just teaching a rural girl her ABCs creates a force more powerful than any government program. She grows up, she leaves the field, she starts a micro-business, and she literally drags the nation's GDP up with her.
And the downstream effects are profound. Decades of sociological research show that when women control household income, a huge share of that money goes straight into the family's health and the children's education.
Which perfectly sets up the next mystery. If the mothers are leaving the fields to trade on the street, what about the youth, the 15 to 24-year-olds?
Yeah, they aren't in the fields either.
Where did they go?
They surged into classrooms. The microdata reveals this massive spatial reshuffling. The drop in youth agricultural employment is almost entirely matched by an enormous spike in school attendance.
So they aren't just following mom to the market. They are banking human capital.
Right.
They are sitting at desks, betting that by the time they graduate, the economy will have a place for them.
It's an intergenerational sacrifice, and this is the seedbed for that within-sector technological growth we need. If these nations are going to survive the end of the people-moving dividend, it will be because this newly educated youth cohort can operate better tech and build formal businesses.
But this transformation isn't happening equally everywhere, right? The continent is splitting into two totally different economic realities.
It is. The NBER paper gets very granular here. And it reveals this fascinating paradox about wealth and growth.
Why is it that the poorer a country is, the easier it is to grow, while the rich countries are agonizingly stuck?
Let's look at Ethiopia. During this golden decade, it was extremely poor, but it posted a massive 5.07% efficiency growth.
And a huge chunk of that was structural change.
Yes, because they had this massive pool of poor farmers. The gap between farming and a basic job in construction was gigantic. So every time someone moved, the national GDP took a massive statistical leap.
But what about the richer nations?
Look at South Africa or Mauritius. Their growth was under 3%, and structural change contributed almost nothing.
Because they ran out of easy moves.
Exactly. In South Africa, agriculture is already highly mechanized. It employs a tiny fraction of the people. The gap between the farm and the urban economy is already closed.
The reservoir of farmers is empty.
So for them, the only way to grow is the painful, expensive grind of actual technological innovation. They have to invent better processes. They can't just reallocate bodies anymore.
But the paper also highlights that even this easy phase of moving people is incredibly fragile. There is a terrifying counterexample in the data. the Madagascar tragedy.
Oh, Madagascar. It serves as this stark warning. While the rest of the continent stepped forward, Madagascar fell into a reversing black hole.
Huh.
Severe political instability in the late 90s and 2000s, the formal urban economy basically shattered. And when the urban safety net disappears, agricultural employment didn't drop. It rose
It went up
from 67.7% up to 72%.
over 4 percentage points. People were fleeing cities and going back to the dirt just to survive.
And the result was exactly what the formula predicts. Total labor productivity collapsed, a direct, tragic spike in poverty. It shows how quickly structural transformation breaks down if the political environment fails.
It really is a dire warning. Which brings us to the biggest, most frustrating roadblock facing the whole continent today. Let's call it the East Asian Wall.
The locked door.
Yeah, we talk about millions of people moving. But anyone looking at this asks, why doesn't Africa just build thousands of mega factories like China did? Why not absorb all these newly literate women and export cheap goods to the West?
Because East Asia slammed the door shut behind them.
Let's look at the numbers. Asian developing countries boast 15% or more in manufacturing employment. Low-income Africa is stuck at 7%.
And they can't break through that ceiling.
Why not? What is keeping them locked out?
Two massive global forces. First, hyper-intense supply chains. China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, they have achieved such massive economies of scale and perfect logistics that an African factory simply cannot compete on price, even if the labor is technically cheaper.
Because the bad roads and expensive electricity wipe out the cheap labor advantage.
Exactly. And the second force is automation. Think about a textile factory in the 80s in Asia. It absorbed thousands of unskilled workers. Today, that same factory uses robotic looms that require just a few specialized technicians.
So the very rungs on the ladder that East Asia used to climb out of poverty, they've been sawed off by robots.
Yes. The traditional sweatshop to superpower narrow gate is blocked.
So visualize this. You have a massive migration. Millions of rural women leaving the fields. Youth graduating school. They arrive in the city, but the factory door is locked. So
Yeah.
where do they go?
They go to the streets. Service sector employment ballooned by over 6%.
But we need to clarify service sector. We aren't talking about software engineers or Starbucks managers.
No, in this context, it's informal services. It's street hawking. A woman setting up a tiny table by the road to sell scratch cards or cooking oil.
It's bloated.
Deeply bloated. Now, selling scratch cards is still mathematically more productive than subsistence farming. It reduces extreme poverty.
But it has a ceiling.
A very hard, low ceiling. A street vendor lacks long-term technological accumulation. She doesn't have economies of scale. She can't invent a new patent. The productivity gain happens instantly when she leaves the farm, but then at flight lines.
So if the factory is locked and street vending has a hard ceiling, is the continent doomed to fall back into the mud? How do you save yourself when the traditional path to wealth is destroyed?
The researchers argue for a total paradigm shift. We have to break the cult-like worship of only manufacturing matters.
This idea that if you don't have smokestacks, you aren't a real economy.
Right. The international community obsesses over forcing an Asian-style industrial revolution. But if that gate is closed, you have to raise the floor for everyone, everywhere.
Indiscriminate, massive investment.
Across all sectors. You improve the roads so the street vendor can trade faster and maybe turn her stall into a real storefront. You improve the schools so the farmer who stays behind can read an agronomy manual or use mobile banking.
You drive marginal efficiency up across the board.
Exactly. You spark a multi-point, self-sustaining transformation. The structural reallocation of bodies bought them time. Now the unglamorous work of building human capital and basic infrastructure has to take over.
Wow. You know, if you are listening to this, you probably started this deep dive thinking about a hopeless continent, a place defined by intractable poverty.
That was the narrative.
But what this data proves is a completely different reality.
Yeah.
You're looking at a landscape where millions of individual people, especially rural women, have quietly, radically rewritten their own economic DNA just by changing how they labor every day.
It is a profound testament to human agency.
But the golden decade we discussed is already in the history books. It ended over 10 years ago. Today, we live in a chaotic world of geopolitical conflicts and wild commodity price swings. So here is something to chew on as you go about your day. Is Africa's current economy just riding another temporary wave, doomed to repeat the tragic cycle of the 1990s when the pressure gets too high? Or has this permanent, micro-level shift in human knowledge and geography built a new, unbreakable foundation for true self-reliance?